We now come to the urgent question. One way or the other, yeah. You shouldn't really make the middle. Sir Roger, you have started something I can do without. Sir Edward. Sir Edward. Not Sir Roger, Sir Edward. Right, let us start with the urgent question. Shadow Secretary of State, Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister if she will make a statement on the situation in Ukraine?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for bringing this urgent statement, which of course is so critical. As the House is well aware, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine poses a significant threat to Euro-Atlantic security and has struck at the heart of the international rules-based system upon which our security and prosperity depend. UK support for Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression is ironclad. Ukraine's incursion into the Russian Oblast of Kursk has proven once again what Ukraine is capable of, but its armed forces remain under considerable pressure on the front line, particularly in the Donbass. And Russia continues to bombard Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure with missiles and drones. The UK will continue to do everything we can to step up and accelerate our support, to keep the pressure up on Putin's war machine, and to hold those responsible for Russia's illegal actions to account. On the day that the new government was appointed, the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary spoke to their Ukrainian counterparts to underline our support. Within 48 hours, the Defence Secretary travelled to Odessa, where he announced a new package of military equipment and pledged to accelerate the delivery of previously announced military aid. During the NATO Washington summit, the Prime Minister committed to provide £3 billion a year of military support for Ukraine until 2030 to 31, or for as long as is needed. Allies also agreed a significant package of support and agreed that Ukraine's pathway to NATO membership is irreversible. On the 18th of July, the Prime Minister hosted President Zelensky and European political community leaders at Blenheim, where 44 European countries and the European Union signed a call to action to tackle Russia's shadow fleet, which is enabling Russia to evade international sanctions. Prime Minister and President Zelensky also agreed a new defence industrial support treaty which enables Ukraine to draw on £3.5 billion of UK export finance. Yesterday, I'm sure the House will want to be aware that the UK-Ukraine Digital Trade Agreement entered into force, which will make digital trade between our two countries cheaper and easier, boosting both our economies. In summary, Ukraine remains high on the agenda, including with our international partners. The Prime Minister discussed Ukraine with Chancellor Scholz and President Macron last week. The Defence Secretary will attend a meeting of the International Ukraine Defence Contact Group on the 5th of September, and we remain in close discussion with Ukraine on the support they need to prevail. Thank you.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question, and may I also thank the Minister for her response. The whole House, Mr. Speaker, condemns and continues to be appalled by Putin's illegal and outrageous attack on a neighbouring foreign state. We condemn the missile and drone attacks launched by Putin against Ukraine in recent weeks, which targets critical infrastructure ahead of winter and murders Ukrainian citizens. Tragically, a missile strike the week before last killed a British national, Ryan Evans, who was in Ukraine working for Reuters. He and his friends and family are in our thoughts today. On these benches, we welcome that negotiations have been initiated for contracts under the recently signed Defence Export Support Treaty. This is a positive step. Increasing Britain's defence production remains a national priority so that we can provide more weapons to Ukraine and build up our own stocks. In government, we made clear that appointing a defence production envoy with a direct line to the Prime Minister would be an effective way of helping to realise that aim. I would be grateful if the Minister could update the House on whether the government intends to see that plan through. Above all, the government must continue, as its predecessor did, to press our allies to go further and working closely, particularly with Germany and France, as well as the American government, to procure the vital supplies that Ukraine must receive. The countries supporting Ukraine are able to leverage a collective GDP and a combined defence budget many times larger than Russia's. Will the Minister confirm that we are pressing allies to follow the UK's multi-year funding commitment for military aid. Turning to the situation in the Kursk region, we agree with the government that Ukraine's right to self-defence against illegal Russian attacks under Article 51 of the UN Charter does not preclude operations inside Russia. Furthermore, together with our allies, we must equip Ukraine so that they are not hampered in their ability to degrade the Russian war effort before it is fully deployed. Mr. Speaker, it is our intention, as His Majesty's opposition, to help the government as they, in turn, take all the necessary decisions to secure advantage and victory for Ukraine. But in giving that support, we expect the government to continue the firm and clear leadership demonstrated by the last Conservative government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want, first of all, to share in the condemnation of those appalling Russian attacks, as was mentioned by the Right Honourable Member. He talked about the impact on critical infrastructure and indeed on a British national. I think the whole House would want to send our condolences to his family and share in the sorrow at such a dreadful incident. But of course we've also seen other appalling attacks, including on other forms of civilian infrastructure as children are returning to school in many parts of England. Today, we of course also are seeing children returning to school in Ukraine, but we saw a 14-year-old girl killed on Friday in Kharkiv. We saw a children's rehabilitation centre also being attacked through Russian aggression just over the last few days. We are absolutely determined that we will continue that rejection of Russian aggression. He talked particularly about the need to ensure that we have that provision of armaments. We are seeking to ensure that we have a National Armaments Director so that we are having that prioritisation. He also talked about the need to be working with our allies, and I did mention in my statement, but I will underline again the fact that the Prime Minister has prioritised this. Of course, he discussed this in detail with Olaf Scholz, also with President Macron as well. This clearly was absolutely critical at the European Political Community meeting as well, and the agreement that was come to with that call of action against the Shadow Fleet was incredibly important, covering the EU and many other European countries as well. He talked about the need for a multi-year approach to this, including from our allies, and of course we will continue to advocate for that. That multi-year support is critical for the UK. We've been very clear that we will extend that until 2030 to 31, or indeed for as long as it is required. That's an incredibly important commitment made by the new UK government. And then he also talked about the actions that we saw taking place in Kursk. The Right Honourable Member is right. Those actions were defensive actions. They would not have taken place if we had not seen the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And therefore, he is completely appropriate in the language that he used to describe them. When it comes to equipping Ukraine in that defensive activity, of course we will continue and indeed have intensified commitment towards that. I was pleased to hear his commitment to cross-party working on this. Of course, my party was determined to ensure we had that cross-party working when in opposition, so I was pleased to hear him affirming that from his new position on the opposite benches. And indeed, we will ensure that we prioritise our support for Ukraine in the future, and I hope he will be working with us in ensuring that. Thank you.
Emily Thornberry.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. In anticipation of this urgent question, I asked a constituent friend of mine who's currently in Kiev what questions I should be asking the Foreign Secretary. And she will be, of course, very reassured that we are increasing the amount of armaments and weapons being sent to Ukraine because they're in desperate need for that. But overnight, Kiev was hit 20 times by missiles. And the overwhelming question that she wants me to ask is what pressure can the UK government put on the Americans to allow the Ukrainians to hit the missile sites in Russia?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these matters, and clearly her contact with that constituent has been incredibly important to understand the situation on the ground. I know that she has a deep understanding of these foreign policy matters as well. The UK is well aware that the US has committed $105 billion in support for Ukraine. It also announced that at the NATO summit at the beginning of July of this year that Germany, Romania, the Netherlands and Italy would be working with the US to provide Ukraine with 5 strategic air defence systems. We've very much welcomed sustained bipartisan US support for Ukraine, which has been absolutely key in the international effort. And I know that the United States will want to continue that support into the future, and certainly we in the UK will be doing all that we can to ensure that remains the case. Thank you.
Lib Dem spokesperson Richard Foord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has spoken of his warm relations with the running mate of Donald Trump, J.D. Vance. And it is just as well, because Vance has said previously that he doesn't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another. While Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister is talking about changes to Russia's doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons, Vance is joking about how Britain is somehow the first Islamist country with nuclear weapons. Can the Minister tell the House what efforts the government is making to rid Vance and some others in the Republican Party of the idea that the security of Ukraine and the security of Europe is somehow not important to the security of the United States?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clearly not for us in this House to speculate about hypothetical scenarios. Decisions about the US election will, of course, lie with the American people. And I would underline to him that the UK and US have been steadfast allies, working closely together on foreign policy issues, defence matters, for over a century. That is applied with leaders of all political stripes in the White House and in Downing Street Parliament and Congress as well. We will welcome and continue to welcome sustained bipartisan US support for Ukraine, including passage of the supplemental funding package, which has been absolutely key to the international effort. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. Welcome the statement from my Right Honourable friend. She did touch on the issue about stockpiles and armaments and missiles, and as she knows, we've had a long-standing problem in terms of those stockpiles. Could you say more about what work is being done now to ensure that those stockpiles are increased and that we can supply more to Ukraine?
So I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising that issue, and we will continue to work very hard to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself in the face of Putin's illegal aggression. As I mentioned in my statement, of course, the Prime Minister has committed to £3 billion a year of military support for Ukraine until 2030-31, or for as long as is needed. And that means that the UK has committed almost £12.7 billion in military, humanitarian and economic support for Ukraine since 2022. But I want to be clear that we are stepping up our military support. That's included via a new package that was announced by the Defence Secretary in Odessa early July. That was very, very soon after the election. That includes, for example, more artillery guns, 250,000 ammunition rounds and 90 precision brimstone missiles, because the stockpile is indeed important, as he mentions.
Fire of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
It seems to me that if you're attacked by a demented bear, you either run away or you hit him so hard that he runs away. But our policy of the West in Ukraine appears to be to wound and not win. In that context, will this government make an unequivocal statement in public that Ukraine should be allowed to use Storm Shadow and, more importantly, the US-made Army tactical missile system, then we might actually win this war?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that specific issue of Storm Shadow, there has been no change in the UK's position. We have been providing military aid to support Ukraine's clear right of self-defence against Russia's illegal attacks. That has been in accordance with international humanitarian law. And we are clear that equipment provided by the UK is intended for the defence of Ukraine.
Gordon McKee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The States will be going to the polls later this year, and that many in the Republican Party are unfortunately expressing scepticism of supporting Ukraine. So can I ask the Minister to encourage our colleagues and allies in the United States that support for Ukraine is vital for our own democracy and security around the world?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my friend for mentioning this important subject. The UK will continue to work closely with our international partners to ensure Ukraine gets the support it needs to resist Russian aggression. And at the NATO summit in Washington, the Prime Minister announced that the UK-administered International Fund for Ukraine will place a new order that will be worth £300 million for 120,000 rounds of ammunition, bolstering Ukraine's defences against Russia. I should also mention that the UK is co-leading a new maritime capability coalition alongside Norway, which will strengthen Ukraine's ability to operate at sea, and a major drone capability coalition with Latvia to scale up the West provision of first-person view drones to Ukraine. So there is extensive and deep work with our allies when it comes to supporting the defence of Ukraine.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the government have a view why certain far-right politicians in the United States, in Europe, and even, dare I say it, in Britain, seem to have a soft spot for President Putin's Russia?
Well, the honourable member, I believe, raises a very important question. It's very clear that Russia's activity under President Putin's illegal leadership has been not only an attack on Ukraine, but of course an attack on democratic values, on international humanitarian law as well. And I'm very pleased that we've seen bipartisan support across this House rejecting that aggression, and I do hope that will continue.
Dan Carlton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Minister's words on Ukraine's activities in Kursk and ask her to give perhaps the fullest possible support from the UK government for what is going on there? Last night, Russian missiles hit Kyiv and other major cities, and it's vital that the UK takes the lead in partnering Ukraine in the defence of democracy and liberty. So can I also ask the Minister, what progress is the government making on completing the 100-year agreement with Ukraine?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much agree with my friend in his comments about the, first of all, about the Kursk offensive, as was mentioned previously, on the situation in Kursk. It ultimately is a defensive operation, and we should not forget, of course, that Russia has repeatedly launched attacks on Ukraine from Kursk Oblast, so this very much was a defensive operation. I also agree with his comments, of course, about recent aerial attacks from Russia, and when it comes to the rejection of those, we could not be clearer. Intentionally directing attacks at civilian objects is a war crime. Those attacks threaten civilian access to power, heating and water supply, impacting the safety and livelihoods of millions of Ukrainians. And we also, in relation to the question about the 100-year partnership, we're committed to ensuring that we cement our partnership with the leadership of Ukraine. That was one that started very early on for the new government. We know there's an important anniversary coming, and we're seeking to mark that with renewed partnership when it does.
Al Pinkerton.
Mr. Speaker, Russian oligarchs close to Putin have numerous assets under UK jurisdiction, equating to nearly £23 billion. Can the Speaker commit to acting on a Lib Dem manifesto commitment to begin the process of seizing currently frozen assets in the UK and repurposing those assets in support of the people of Ukraine, building financial resilience in UK domestic national support, even if US support were to waver following the US election in November? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. He's absolutely right in what I believe is the implication of his question, which is that we need to have a robust sanctions regime. That's something that this government is absolutely committed to. Without sanctions, we estimate Russia would have over $400 billion more to fund its war for another 4 years. So it really is important that we continue with that sanctions regime and do what we can to ensure that it is impossible to circumvent. And I believe perhaps his point was around that particular issue. Now, there is an international system and movement towards ensuring that Russian sovereign assets are indeed put into play when it comes to support for people who've been so appallingly impacted in Ukraine. We are working intensively with all of our allies to pursue lawful ways to ensure that Russia meets its obligations, and together with our G7 partners, we've agreed to make available approximately $50 billion to Ukraine by the end of the year by advancing the extraordinary profits generated by immobilised Russian sovereign assets in the EU and other relevant jurisdictions. So work is already ongoing, I believe, on the issues that he mentioned, if I understand correctly. Thank you.
Lord MacDougall.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome what the Minister said about the Russian shadow fleet and the efforts to tackle that. She'll also be aware that there's an estimated £600 million worth of refined products of Russian origin that have made their way into our economy. What more can she do, given her answer a moment ago about the need for a robust sanctions regime to crack down on that? Because the democracy in Kyiv will find it more difficult to win if we're also funding the dictatorship in Moscow.
I'm very grateful to my friend for raising this important point, because Putin's shadow fleet softened the blow of our sanctions regime, and it poses serious maritime security and environmental risks as well. Now, the new government has already taken decisive action in response. Earlier this month, we sanctioned 11 Russian ships, and almost all sanctioned tankers have ceased trading Russian oil. At the EPC summit, 44 countries, as I mentioned before, in the EU, signed a call to action that was spearheaded by the UK, calling out the risks posed by the shadow fleet and committing to work together to confront those risks. Now, I won't speculate on future decisions around our sanctions regime, but of course we will always keep it under review.
Mark Francis. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I follow the fire of the House's excellent point on storm shadow? There is no third country exercising a veto on how Putin uses long-range missiles, which he uses without compunction, even to attack children's hospitals in Ukraine. And yet the media consistently report there is an American veto on Ukrainian use of Storm Shadow missiles to attack targets at depth in Russia, even though that would materially assist the Ukrainian war effort. So can the Minister and the Foreign Office and the MOD talk with our American allies to get that veto removed, because the Ukrainians are fighting for our freedom too, and 2 years in, they can no longer be expected to do it with one hand tied behind their back.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I mentioned previously in this important debate, the UK Government will continue to work with all of our allies from all parties that are engaged in this, seeking to ensure we do all we can to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and to enable them to exercise their right of self-defence against Putin's illegal aggression. As I mentioned before, there has been no change in the UK's position on the matters that he specified. We have been providing military aid to support Ukraine's clear right of self-defence against Russia's illegal attacks in accordance with international humanitarian law, and we are clear that equipment provided by the UK is intended for the defence of Ukraine.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the Minister's the strength and detail of her statement. Now, my constituents in Newcastle and Lyme stand very firmly with the people of Ukraine, and last night I met a man called Alex, a Ukrainian who has made his life in Newcastle under Lyme. Now, he has no family left in the Ukraine after the recent death of his brother in Kyiv. Now, that's evidence, Mr Speaker, that this crisis remains so very serious for so many people indeed. Now, notwithstanding the Minister's answer on sanctions and assets, can I urge her to look at what we can do to redouble our efforts to use the assets seized from Russian folks here to support Ukrainians in their fight against tyranny, not just in Ukraine, but here in the United Kingdom too?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I very much would share my friend's deep concern about the human impact of Putin's illegal war on Ukraine. Overall, we've heard, of course, in February 2024 from President Zelensky that 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed during Russia's full-scale invasion, and very large numbers of civilians have been as well. OHCHR reports over 11,000 civilians have been killed and over 23,000 wounded. That was as of the start of August this year. When it comes to ensuring that we take action on assets, this new government is absolutely committed to doing everything we can in this area. As I mentioned before, the UK has sanctioned over 2,000 individuals and entities, and without sanctions we estimate Russia would have over $400 billion more to fund its illegal war. Of course, we will continue to keep this under review and work with partners to ensure our sanctions are as strong as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is, of course, right when she said that the next US President is a matter solely for the American people. But a Trump presidency will, without doubt, have a significant impact on the course of the war in Ukraine. And given his relationship, his cosy relationship with Putin, I very much doubt that impact will be a positive one. So can she reassure this House, and I suspect the people of Ukraine, that this government is, or soon will be, speaking to our European allies to ensure that in terms of procurement and engagement, that Europe will be prepared to plug any gaps than what Ukraine needs to defend itself should the worst case become a reality after November?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question, and this government has repeatedly engaged with our allies on the need for continued support for Ukraine. That's been the case, for example, with the European political community, the meetings that we had there, the call to action that came out of that on the shadow fleet. It's been the case with all the engagement we've had, of course, with NATO allies as well, and also with the Prime Minister's engagement with Olaf Scholz and President Macron just a few days ago. So that will continue. It's critically important for the UK government. We have welcomed sustained bipartisan US support for Ukraine. It has been key to the international effort, and I would just underline what I said before. The UK and US have been steadfast allies, working closely together for over a century. That has applied regardless of political stripe across the institutions in both of our countries, and we're determined that will continue. Thank you.
Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the government's very positive response to this urgent question? But can I just press her on the storm shadow issue, because there's really no point in the West arming Ukraine to shoot down the missiles when they can't shoot down the launch pads. What discussions is the government having with our American counterparts? Will she confirm that a request has been made to the US administration? When are we expecting an answer? And if the answer is no, what will we do?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I believe that I have been crystal clear, and the UK government has been crystal clear, that we will do everything we can to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and to ensure that it has the equipment it needs to defend its territory from Russia's illegal invasion. And he will understand that we will not comment on operational decision-making.
Samuel Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, Ukrainian refugees in my constituency have expressed their welcome that there's been continuity of approach to the situation in Ukraine after the change of government. The Minister has mentioned on a number of occasions today the fact that we are giving a long-term arms commitment to Ukraine. But given the concerns that there have been about, first of all, the equipment and ammunition available to our own armed forces, how can she make such a commitment, and what steps has she taken to ensure that the defence industry in the United Kingdom is geared up to meet both the commitments for our own armed forces and for the ones she's making to Ukraine?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for making that absolutely critical point. And it's very clear that when we have that kind of long-term commitment to ensuring that there is provision of defence capacity to our allies, to our friends, that is not only important for those countries, and here, in this case, for Ukraine. It's also incredibly important for our own domestic industrial capacity as well. It ensures that we can, for the long term, secure jobs in our own country, that there are long-term contracts, long-term prospects, and indeed careers for people in our own country working in defence industries. Thank you.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's attack on Ukraine by Russian missiles and drones represented the biggest since the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. Can she make it crystal clear that Ukraine's right to self-defence must include the ability to target where those missiles and drones originate, including Russian aircraft in Russian airspace and Russian missile bases?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And he's absolutely right to condemn the truly appalling recent attacks that we saw. They provided yet more evidence that Russia is seeking to, frankly, terrorise the Ukrainian population into submission. That is an approach that we wholly reject, that we condemn, that runs contrary, of course, to international humanitarian law. And the UK will continue to do everything we can to support Ukraine's resilience and support its defence in this situation. And I did mention before, but I will just underline, given the point that he made on this subject, that of course when it comes to the Kursk operation, that was a defensive operation, and we should not forget that Russia reportedly and repeatedly launched attacks on Ukraine from Kursk Oblast.
Rachel Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the topic of Ukraine, we've heard about the role of Russian assets in this country. The Minister will be aware of the concerns that I have about asset ownership in the constituency of the cities of London and Westminster, and how vital it is for UK economic growth that we can pride ourselves on having a clean and transparent financial markets in the City of London. Does the Minister agree with me that securing transparency through trust ownership is a really important part of making sure that we can understand ownership of assets in this country, and that we can't wait any longer for enforcement around transparency of trust in order to secure our understanding of this situation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am very well aware of my friend's leadership on these issues and her long-term commitment to ensuring transparency. Of course, she will understand that precise rules around financial instruments are not for the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. They are instead, of course, for His Majesty's Treasury. However, I can say to her on the broader issue that we are very clear that effective sanctions will, of course, require effective enforcement and implementation, and will continue to strengthen our work, including with international partners and allies, and through our role at the UN, to maximise the impact of sanctions, to close loopholes and to close other channels for circumventing sanctions. Thank you.
Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Right Honourable Lady recognise the enormous contribution which the Ukrainian diaspora here in the UK has made to supporting their countrymen, not just in practical terms but in morale terms? And will she ensure that the government continues to do everything it can to support their endeavours?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for mentioning that point, because it's incredibly important. I think just about every member in this House will have had the privilege and honour of meeting Ukrainians who've moved to their constituency, not, of course, sadly through choice, but through necessity. They've enriched our communities, and they are indeed supporting those back at home. It really is important that the government continues to work with them, both so we get an accurate picture of what's taking place, of course, but also so that we can ensure we play our part in supporting Ukraine in its self-defence against Putin's aggression.
Gurinder Singh Josam.
This House should commend the undoubted success of the brave Ukraine forces in their incursion into the Russian Kursk region. But we also see that they remain under significant stress across the whole region. Can the Minister identify what support the UK government has provided, military support the UK government has provided to the Ukraine armed forces since the general election, and what commitment we have in place going forward?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my friend for raising that important question, and I want to be very clear that we are stepping up our military support for the reasons that he mentions. That includes via the new package that was announced, of course, in Odessa by the Defence Secretary. I think it was about in his second day in the job. That includes more artillery guns, 250,000 ammunition rounds, 90 precision brimstone missiles, and we are speeding up that support as well. So the Defence Secretary has also announced that we will ensure the package of military aid that was promised in April under the previous government, which includes air defence missiles, that's delivered in full to Ukraine within the next 100 days. That was on the 7th of July.
James Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What action is the government taking with our allies to crack down on sanction dodging, which is leading to critical components for military equipment, including drones, getting into Russia?
Well, this government is absolutely committed to ensuring that there is not sanctions dodging, that we have an effective sanctions regime. It's absolutely critical when it comes to ensuring that Putin's illegal war does not succeed, and over £20 billion worth of UK-Russia bilateral trade is now under full or partial sanction as we speak. Imports from Russia into the UK have fallen by more than 99%, and exports to Russia have fallen by more than 75%. Of course, I mentioned previously the fact that we've been working to tackle the so-called shadow fleet, working with our allies and partners to ensure we have robust action in that area, but we will continue to keep the system under review.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Minister on both the tone and the substance of her response here today, and I see the Foreign Secretary coming into the chamber. The President of Ukraine has lauded the UK for its leadership in arms, politics, support for Ukrainian society. But can the Minister say, why did he say that since the election that support had slowed?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for his question, but I have to say that the Prime Minister could not have been clearer that the UK's support for Ukraine is unwavering. This is a cross-party commitment coming from the UK, absolutely clear, and we continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. That's why, of course, the Prime Minister committed to £3 billion a year of support to Ukraine for as long as it takes within his first week in office. A new commitment, one we believed it was important to make to underline that continued support. And as a further signal of the strength of the relationship, you'll remember that the Prime Minister called President Zelensky on his first day in the job, and the Defence Secretary visited Kyiv just hours later. So that commitment could not be clearer. Thank you.
Andrew Sutton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. BAE Systems in my constituency in Field and its workforce across Lancashire, indeed from the Speaker's constituency as well, in Chorley, has been at the forefront of the armaments supply to Ukraine. The Typhoon project at the Wharton site starts to hit a lull from next year, where there is no more assembly of Typhoons. But we know that countries directly affected by Russia's aggression across its border wish to place Typhoon orders in coming years. But there will be a delay in which we can critically supply those important aircraft to strategic partners. And will the Minister commit to working with myself, other MPs from Lancashire and BAE Systems on how we can fill that gap in the production assembly of Typhoon fighter jets to make sure that when our allies and partners need those jets, that they will be available, and to the benefit as well for jobs across Lancashire and indeed for exports for the UK economy?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I would want to pay tribute to those British workers who have been ensuring that absolutely essential material is being delivered when it's so much needed. And that really does show UK technology, of course, at its best. And I'm assured that the Defence Secretary would be keen to meet with him. He's well aware of these challenges. He'd be interested in ensuring there's that conversation. And of course, the new UK government has been absolutely clear that we're determined to have a long-term strategy for defence that includes for our defence industries as well.
Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As with so many things in international affairs, American support is indispensable, and so it is in support for Ukraine. Yet the election of President Trump et al. Threatens that. Has the government conducted any contingency planning as to how to continue full support for Ukraine in the event of the potential election of President Trump?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm grateful to the member for his question. I don't want to repeat word for word what I said previously. He will, I'm sure, understand that the US and UK have worked together over 100 years on issues of importance. That has not varied despite the party political composition of leaderships in our two countries. We will not be speculating about hypothetical scenarios. Instead, we will be ensuring that we continue to work with our allies to ensure that the Ukrainian people who have so bravely been defending their country are supported in their self-defence by the UK. Thank you.
That leaves us with just Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank very much the Minister for her very confident answers. They will encourage us all in this House and indeed our constituents back home as well, and thank her for that. As the Minister stated in her statement, as our children, in my case my 6 grandchildren, and indeed all the other children, make their way back into their classrooms in safety and security today, our minds are with those children in Ukraine unable to access an education. I hope or indeed even a future. Can the Minister outline what discussions have taken place to ensure that those children remaining in Ukraine have access to their education, to vocational training and indeed to a very future? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for that very important point, and want to thank him for his kind words as well, and congratulate him on 6 grandchildren. I'm sure I've heard that before, but that is quite an achievement. He, of course, raises an incredibly important, maybe not entirely just down to him, of course, but the issue that he raises, is clearly a very sad one indeed, and it is about the fact that we see, of course, children being put in a very difficult position. Indeed, we've seen appalling levels actually of children who've been killed due to that Russian aggression, but also then the impact on essential services for them, whether that be education, but also healthcare as well, with some of the impacts of the conflict that we've seen. And I would want to assure him, we haven't really managed to cover this in the debate, Mr. Speaker, but that the UK, when it comes to humanitarian support, is absolutely committed to supporting Ukraine. I've been working very hard on that as Minister for Development, as he would expect, and that will include across a range of services, but particularly humanitarian matters and energy as we come into the winter too. Thank you.
Right, that completes the UQ. We will now move on to the statement. Let the front benches change over.